Thank you, Professor Kong. It's very nice to be here. I'm looking forward to this lecture. I really enjoy talking to students and the general public about North Korea and U.S. foreign policy in general. And kind of what I'm going to talk about today is a variety of things, but focus primarily on the issue of asymmetry in foreign policy, because this is the key issue which really kind of exists in the relationship between the United States and North Korea, and really kind of governs how the U.S.-North Korea interaction proceeds and has proceeded over decades. But before I get into that, a little bit about me. My background is I started my career back in the early 1980s. I spent several years abroad, supporting the U.S. government, looking at the Soviet Union, and I was a Sovietologist. That's what I was educated in. And really up until really the late 1980s, around 1988, when I shifted over to focus on North Korea, and primarily the issue of leadership politics inside North Korea and how North Korea makes decisions. Over the decades, I have interviewed and met with most or many North Korean high-level defectors, and had very deep conversations with them about North Korea and how the regime operates. And I oversee now at CNA a team called the Adversary Analytics Group that studies foreign adversaries of the United States and does deep studies on these countries. And so that is kind of from where I'm coming from on this study, on this speech today. And before I get started, I think we need to understand a little bit about North Korea in terms of how I approach the study of North Korea, as well as some things about how North Korea makes its decisions, and keep that in mind as I'm talking about the larger part of this study, which is asymmetry in the U.S.'s interaction with North Korea, because it'll probably, I think, begin to make sense about why we haven't made very much progress in our engagement with our relationship with North Korea to try to get our hands around the issue of denuclearization. So when I study any adversary, I really start from the inside and then work my way out. So you start from the point of view of the leadership, what makes the leadership tick, how they make decisions. And this is based on a five levels of methodology at looking at a particular adversary. The first level is the bioanalysis, the who's who in the zoo. Who are the key people within the leadership? What do we know about them? How are they basically interact with each other, or how they related to each other, things like that. The second level is what we call landscape analysis, is how these individuals come together within the politics and the culture of the particular regime that we're looking at. The third level is called the decision-making level. How do these individuals come together at a formal and informal level in order to make decisions regarding domestic policy, foreign policy, national security policy? Level 4 is basically tension analysis. Where in the system, both organizationally and personally, are there tensions that exist between the various entities and individuals within the regime that can affect decision-making? And finally is impact analysis. Once you've done all of this analysis of the regime, how can you effectively have a foreign policy, or how can you effectively engage or influence the particular adversary or country target that you're looking at? And when I apply all of this analysis to North Korea, I see that basically we have a lot of holes. We don't know a whole lot about the individuals inside North Korea other than the very top individuals. We have very little understanding of the culture that exists within North Korea and how these individuals come together and how they make decisions. And we know that over time, Kim Il sung made decisions very differently than Kim Jong il and very differently from Kim Jong un. Today, we know very little about the tensions that exist within the system that can impact how the system reacts to external stimuli, such as attempts to engage or pressure the regime. And so, therefore, we have very little understanding about how to properly uh, engage or try to influence the regime. And so that's kind of where we're stuck today. And so we keep all of that in mind as I start to talk now about asymmetry, which I think is a basic concept in foreign policy that is really at the heart of the U.S. North Korean relationship. So when we do a cursory examination of public statements by U.S. officials and national security trade journals, it makes clear that Washington is two things. One, we're trying to pivot to Asia, and two is that we view great power competition as the greatest challenge of the 21st century. So we remember really from the into the World War II up until the 1990s, we had the Cold War, then we had this kind of gap, and then we had the war on terrorism, and now we're in kind of what we call the period of great power competition, where basically the U.S. is focusing on primary adversaries such as Russia and China, and that is really kind of driving a lot of their foreign policy and really decision making regarding national security. And this makes sense. It falls neatly in the U.S. security thinking since the end of the Cold War, and it attempts by U.S. adversaries to overturn or alter the international order comes with high stakes for the international community and is tied to efforts by both sides to exert influence while maintaining deterrence. This competition also helps justify, if you look at U.S. foreign policy and how foreign policy is made in U.S. national security policy, a big component of that is our defense industrial complex. In other words, we're constantly developing our weapon systems and our capabilities. And, in order to do that effectively, you really have to focus at the high end of your adversarial relationships in the world in order to justify your high-end weapon systems and things like that, and the arsenal that you're going to employ into your military. What it does not do, all of this sort of thing, well, the pivot of Asia does, but not the competition part, the great power competition. What it does not do, I would argue, is help the U.S. focus on important and much more likely threats to come from non-peer adversaries. And this would include North Korea. Adversaries who, because of their asymmetrically weaker military and economic status vis-a-vis the United States, fall into a category of challenges that need to be managed much more than problems that need to be solved. So they do not set the pace for U.S. national security policy. Unless they act up, this particular adversary, they are placed on the back burner, ignored in the interest of the status quo. Nowhere is this more clear than on the Korean Peninsula and the asymmetric relationship that exists between the U.S. and North Korea. Asymmetry in relations between the United States and less powerful adversaries creates challenges not easily addressed by traditional foreign and security policy initiatives. The relative imbalance in the relationship between the United States and weaker powers carries unique dynamics, which over time can change the international landscape more and more so than those occurring within the great power competition, I would argue, at the great power competition level. It is within this space of asymmetric imbalance that long-held principles of the liberal democratic order, such as non-proliferation, are being eroded and overturned. These asymmetric dynamics and relationships are understudied and misunderstood, thus potentially putting the U.S. in a challenging position with limited room for compromise and a burden to uphold the sanctity of the status quo under constant attack by these non-peer adversaries. Pressure campaigns from the last few U.S. administrations have found mixed success with asymmetrically weaker powers. Under President Barack Obama, pressure helped pave the way for a deal to slow down and cap Iran's burgeoning nuclear program. North Korea, on the other hand, has remained relatively immune to U.S. pressure diplomacy aimed at curtailing its nuclear program, taking only limited and reversible steps toward denuclearization. The U.S.'s asymmetric challenge with North Korea stems from four primary causes. One, a conflict of interest between the weaker power, North Korea, and the stronger power, the United States. Two, divergence between the two powers on the relative value of North Korea's nuclear program. Three, contentment versus dissatisfaction with the status quo. And four, North Korea's fear of becoming even weaker if the status quo continues. Asymmetry in the international arena often manifests itself when a conflict of interest arises between the revisionist power, or the weaker power, and the status quo power, or the stronger power, over a substantive issue which each values to varying degrees. In recent years, non-proliferation has been at the heart of contention between countries that exist outside of the established international order and the dominant powers, namely the United States and its allies, that created the order and follow its rules. Asymmetrically weaker adversaries tend to pursue nuclear programs as a means of deterrence and a source of influence, while status quo powers try to restrict the spread of nuclear capability, which they view as inherently destabilizing to the established order. Escalation occurs as attempts at negotiated settlement fail, or when a series of misperceived actions and reactions between the parties devolves into a crisis, which we have seen on the Korean Peninsula from time to time. The relative value of the issue in dispute, along with the unwillingness of the status quo power to concede ground, can increase the resolve of the revisionist power, or the weaker power, which may have a more of a stake in the dispute than the status quo power does. The United States is a world power. Its asymmetrically weaker adversaries have predominantly been regional perspectives and equities, affecting the amount of energy they are willing to invest in to save face and achieve a favorable outcome. From a diplomatic point of view, this situation can lead to unforeseen consequences, especially on the part of the stronger power, which has other competing interests to consider, both domestic and foreign. And this is why you tend to see the United States basically put a lot of the challenges that it has with the non-peer adversaries on the back burner unless there's a crisis that they have to deal with. And so therefore the status quo just persists, but the problems never get solved. Related to the value of each country places on the issue are the views that each holds about the disparity in power in an asymmetric relationship. The greater the disparity, the greater the chance that negotiations on issues of intrinsic or strategic value to both countries will bog down and fail to yield results. The status quo power may be reluctant to make concessions for several reasons. First, it holds advantages in the military and diplomatic realm, and the consequences of failed diplomacy are viewed as more manageable. Second, making concessions to a revisionist power might make the status quo power look weak and have negative consequences for its relations with its allies and its adversaries, other adversaries. Because it dominates the established order, the status quo power tends to assume the right to set the rules. including dictating to the revisionist power what it needs to do to reach an agreement that fits within the international order. For its part, the revisionist power will likely see this as intransigence, which will undermine its desire to seek a negotiated settlement. According to Frank Fritsch, the status quo power will likely demand concessions up front, and the revisionist power will fear that making such concessions will further weaken its position in the asymmetric relationship and undermine its domestic standing as negotiations proceed. He notes that to have any chance at successful negotiations, both parties must be able to perceive a win-win perspective. One of the frustrating characteristics of asymmetric competition is that it can lead stronger powers to believe they can impose a solution because of their superior capabilities and bargaining advantages. This is something that stronger countries would not contemplate in the context of great power competition. And that's why we see that we organize and operate at the great power competition level very differently than we do below that level. With a weaker power, however, the status quo takes the approach that a drawn-out negotiations that require upfront concessions by the weaker power can be avoided if its adversary can be made to recognize that giving in its equities on a particular issue to avoid further conflict is the best course of action. If an agreement is not reached, the status quo power may use the threat of further pressure to achieve better outcome for itself. And we see this every time North Korea does a test or whatever, or in the past, we generally saw the United States go and its allies go to the United Nations to lob on more sanctions on top of North Korea to try to add to that pressure. An additional advantage that the stronger power often possesses is the legitimacy that the status quo confers, especially on issues such as preventing nuclear proliferation. Therefore, status quo powers generally attempt to prolong their control over the issue in dispute with the expectation that as time passes, it will increase the legitimacy of their position. For the revisionist power, or the weaker power, the continuation of the status quo further weakens its position over time. For this reason, if the issue concerns the country's legitimacy, the leadership will often refuse to capitulate and will instead look for ways to break the status quo. It might decide to create a crisis, for example, by engaging in provocations to warn the status quo country that ignoring the situation or trying to impose a solution will not work and in fact could make matters worse. This strategy can also create tensions within the status quo alliances, with some countries breaking rank because they see the stronger country or the status quo power as increasingly intransigent. Because both sides typically prefer to avoid war, the revisionist power has some latitude to take on risk to erode the status quo. And we see this with North Korea when they conduct provocations, as they did in 2015 along the DMZ, when they're constantly doing tests. They know there's a certain amount of risk involved in this, but it's something that they believe they should take on in order to challenge the status quo. The revisionist power most likely values the issue in dispute more than the status quo power, which must contend with larger equities beyond its particular dispute. So I would argue that when it comes to denuclearization, the issue of denuclearization is a much bigger deal to the North Koreans than ultimately it is to the United States, even though the United States supports the issue of non-proliferation around the world. At the end of the day, North Korea sees this as an existential issue, more so the United States sees it as an irritant in international and regional affairs that it must deal with and contend with. Because of those equities, the status quo power is often reluctant to threaten or use force to obtain the desired concessions, especially if low-cost military options are not available. If the revisionist power then can secure wins within the dispute, it may be able to leverage those victories to erode the status quo. And this is basically North Korea's strategy, and has been over the decades, is step by step slowly trying to erode the status quo by getting to a point where the international community will recognize North Korea as a nuclear power. So these dynamics of asymmetry have largely governed the U.S.-North Korean relationship for the last 40 years. The Biden administration has moved away from the high-stakes transactional diplomacy of the Trump administration to pursue the strategy of coercion or strategic patience, similar to what we saw under the Obama administration's foreign policy, toward asymmetrically weaker adversaries who defied key U.S. security objectives. So if we look really over the last several years, several administrations in the United States, you had basically in the 1990s, you had North Korea moving away from the concept of reunification of the Korean Peninsula under North Korean rule, which had been basically the governing strategy of North Korea since 1945, and the realization that they could no longer win a conventional war on the peninsula, toward an asymmetric strategy of having a nuclear program which could create a deterrent for the regime, but also could help them with leverage on destroying the status quo. North Korea's strategy became centered around two things. And these are two things that you should keep in mind with regard to North Korea, because North Korea, or the Kim family, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, had these two objectives in mind at all times, and it governed every single decision that they made, whether it was domestic, foreign policy, national security policy. The first objective was regime survival. And this definitely came into force in the 1990s, replacing reunification as their primary objective for the regime, so regime survival. But number two, and just as important, and I would argue even more important, is perpetuation of Kim family rule. North Korea will do absolutely nothing that violates either regime survival or perpetuation of Kim family rule. And if you look at the issue of denuclearization, it violates both of those objectives. It makes North Korea, from their perspective, more vulnerable, and it also takes away the sole source of legitimacy for the Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung as the supreme leader, because in the absence of economic progress in the country, the only thing that the leader can fall back on in terms of legitimacy within the wider leadership and the country writ large is development of the nuclear program. So you can see how North Korea, places the nuclear program in very high status. And if you're going to stop it or you're going to get rid of it, it's going to take very deft diplomacy to be able to do that. And I would argue that because of this asymmetric relationship that has existed between the United States and North Korea, really going back since the 1990s, if not beyond, is that that the U.S. policy of trying to deal with North Korea has taken, with the exception, I would argue, at the very end of the Clinton administration, when it actually tried to engage North Korea, has been really a failed policy to deal with North Korea. For the most part, we have tried to enforce status quo, but in terms of making any progress on denuclearization, it's been pretty much a failure. We have gotten North Korea to kind of back off their program a couple of times, but then things happen, crises occur, and North Korea returns to developing its program again. So I would argue that a return to traditional pressure strategies, which we've now seen under the Biden administration, will likely lead to continued stalemate, or worse, a growth of adversarial threat held unaccountable. An empirical analysis of interaction between North Korea and the United States on the issue of North Korea's nuclear program shows that traditional foreign policy tools like coercive diplomacy have limited impact. With North Korea, engagement cannot be conducted as a black and white zero-sum game. it must be re-examined and incorporated into a larger regional strategy. And I will talk about that in a little bit here. So what is to be done? What's the solution to all of this? Now that North Korea has assumed a more intransigent profile, which may continue to escalate as long as the status quo exists. And we really saw this after the failure in Hanoi with the attempted summit in Hanoi that fell apart. And then you had at the next party Congress, basically Kim start to talk about going in a different direction and moving away from diplomacy and basically focusing more on its relationship with China and Russia. And then also returning to testing, which they had really held off for quite some time. And now over the last couple of years, they have conducted dozens of tests of medium and long range missiles. They haven't conducted a 7th nuclear test yet, but they are making definite improvements in at least in their missile capability. And we suspect that they have, with the 6th nuclear tests, been able to reduce the amount of material that they would need to be able to create warheads. But up until this point, they have not done 3 important things, or they have not done 2 important things that are required for a full-up nuclear program. They've not made it a warhead to a missile, and they have not shown that a missile with a warhead can do re-entry into the atmosphere. These are 2 critical tests in order to have a full-blown nuclear program. They have shown that they have a missile capability which can range the United States when done at a lofted trajectory. So in other words, they have not done a flat trajectory, which would be a much more aggressive test, but they've done a lofted trajectory, which when you do the extrapolation, which show that they have, with the Hwasong 15 and potentially the Hwasong 17, the ability to range the entire United States. But that is a missile that does not have a warhead on it and has not shown re-entry capability. Once they do that, then the status quo will flip. Once the status quo flips, the North Koreans will be in the advantaged position, not the United States at that point. So there are a number of things that the Biden administration can do if it wants to actively pursue its goals regarding North Korea, rather than default to another period of strategic patience. I would argue that strategic patience, which basically guided basically the Bush administration, the Obama administration, now the Biden administration, will not work. And North Korea will continue to develop its capability under strategic patience until the point that it gets a viable nuclear program. But if you're going to do something other than strategic patience, these are some things that I would suggest that you consider. First, it should undertake a serious assessment of the Trump era's top-down approach and see whether aspects of this thinking could be used to reinvigorate diplomacy. President Trump is a very unconventional president, tried something very different with North Korea, and it did resonate, at least at a very strategic level. And that was to engage one-on-one with North Korea at the highest levels, president to supreme leader, and then basically through the summits try to come to some sort of an agreement. The problem is the Trump administration really had no follow-through whatsoever. And it had something called the maximum pressure strategy, which was basically strategic patience on steroids, in which it tried to force North Korea into doing something. So it had the right engagement strategy. It had no follow-through or national security strategy with regard to North Korea. And I think there was ultimately a failure, but I think there are elements of it that could be taken away, such as how to actually engage with the North Koreans. Given that the nature of the North Korean regime, decision-making is concentrated in the person of the supreme leader, in this case, Kim Jong-un, making a bottom-up approach where we traditionally do when we engage adversaries or even allies, where you start with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and you work your way up. That doesn't work in a country like North Korea because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not have the latitude to make decisions that are necessary in order to get you to a higher level and have discussions at the highest levels on issues of importance like denuclearization. So if you're trying to do it from the bottom up, this with North Korea, it's basically ineffective and counterproductive. Summit diplomacy can still be a good avenue, though I would argue for purposefully to engage with the North Koreans, but it's going to have to start at the level of the White House, not at the level of the State Department. Second, while it might not be potentially feasible for a conventional president such as President Biden to meet with Kim himself, he could consider appointing a special representative and give him significant authority to act on his behalf. In addition, the president should also consider publicly endorsing President Yoon's offer of inter-Korean dialogue. These steps would put a framework in place for exploratory negotiations designed to determine the art of the possible, and in particular, what concessions each side is willing to make. This is what I found that the Moon administration did very well, is that they were able to, because the President Trump was willing to engage with North Korea, then the inter-Korean dialogue could take place, because the inter-Korean dialogue cannot take place as long as the United States and North Korea are not talking, because North Korea knows that South Korea needs to go to the United States in order to get, a strategy on what sort of concessions can be made. And so from North Korea's point of view, it makes no sense to talk to North Korea unless the United States has blessed that engagement. And so really since the period of summitry, we have seen no inter-Korean dialogue. But if you were able to have that inter-Korean dialogue, the South Korean president could meet with Kim Jong-un and really kind of lay the table of what is possible in terms of what concessions each side could make and in what sequence they would need to be made before the US and North Korea meet face to face, and then kind of follow through on that. That's kind of how the Trump administration or engagement under the Trump administration worked. But as I said, the Trump administration had no follow-through strategy, which meant that it ultimately was going to all fall apart. So third, the Biden administration should consider refraining from demonizing North Korea, which will only cause Pyongyang to lash out further and eschew and ignore diplomatic outreach. The White House needs to see North Korea as it is, not as it would wish to see it. And really, I would say one of the biggest mistakes then in U.S. foreign policy was when President George W. Bush, made the axis of evil speech, and they put North Korea on the axis of evil. And that basically put North Korea on a high alert that to see the United States, as it has seen really since the Korean War, as the primary threat out there and a country that cannot be engaged. And so if all you're going to do is treat North Korea as the enemy and use very kind of harsh language toward North Korea, and I know the thing that you're saying, well, North Korea uses harsh language against us. Again, we're talking about an asymmetric relationship. What a more powerful country says carries more weight than what a weak party says. And part of North Korea's propaganda and whatever is to speak very aggressively. It needs to do that in order to make itself look much more powerful than it is. But when the United States does that toward North Korea, it just shuts off avenues of engagement. Fourth, and this is, I think, very important, is that the administration should consider revisiting basic principles of U.S. North Korea policy. Instead of adhering to a black and white zero-sum game on the Korean Peninsula, we need to add flexibility into our strategy. We need to open it up. We need to make it more regional and make it a step-by-step approach. The administration should look for ways to introduce pragmatism into a reality-based approach. I would argue right now we have a very wishful, we're hoping for the best sort of approach. It is not really based in reality to ultimately get us where we need to go. In terms of the framework, the U.S. North Korea policy, it is unsuitable for a situation the United States finds itself with this particular adversary, North Korea. Geography and 70 years of history have created a situation where the United States cannot dictate its will that North Korea denuclearize. Washington does not possess such leverage, and its past actions towards regimes such as Iraq and Libya have made the situation even more difficult by crystallizing in the minds of North Korean leaders that only a nuclear deterrent will forestall and prevent regime change. This has created an intractable position both countries find themselves in today, a zero-sum game where there must be an absolute winner and an absolute loser. Because this relationship is an asymmetric one, North Korea, as the weaker power, is not willing to make the first move. For its part, the United States feels it has right on its side in pursuing nuclear nonproliferation and is unwilling to reward bad behavior by giving in first on economic and security guarantees that Pyongyang covets. So in other words, we're not willing to go first, and the North Koreans are not willing to go first. So we're stuck. In the background, China continues to rise and spread its influence throughout Asia. Beijing values stability on its border and likely views denuclearization as a wedge issue to keep the United States off balance. So I would argue that because this is something U.S. policymakers really going back to the Clinton administration have tried. Go to China, get China to put pressure on North Korea to denuclearize. That will not work. Why won't it work? Because China's North Korea policy begins with stability on its border, and somewhere down here there is denuclearization. So China is not going to carry our water for us. They did for a certain period of time under Obama, but then things fell apart in the relationship between China and the United States, and China has no incentive to make U.S. life easier by pressuring North Korea. They see North Korea as a wedge issue that they can use to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States, and it plays into China's larger equities in the region, whereas the United States continues to butt its head up against a black and white policy on Korea in which it has absolutely no leverage to affect. So since the Singapore summit, the U.S.-China relations have soured, and Beijing's support for sanctions and the U.S. maximum pressure strategy have begun to wane as well. In other words, whenever we go to the United Nations asking for more sanctions, there's China and Russia sitting there saying, no, not going to happen. And they get a vote on the Security Council, which means there's no way we can really pressure North Korea into doing anything at this point. In order to address this challenge, U.S. policymakers need to make two major shifts in their strategy. First, drop denuclearization as a single solitary objective of U.S. strategy toward North Korea. As currently constituted, denuclearization is a conditioned precedent for negotiations instead of serving as an ultimate goal of the end of a process. In other words, we're asking North Korea to take steps toward denuclearization at the front end of diplomacy, as opposed to having it be the goal at the back end of the diplomacy where it belongs. In other words, we're putting the cart before the horse here. In addition, the United States uses denuclearization as a measuring stick by which to evaluate its overall relationship with North Korea. This leaves Pyongyang in an untenable position of losing face whenever it makes a concession on its program. As a result, it is unwilling to take any verifiable and irreversible steps which would harm its ability to reconstitute its program if diplomacy fails. In other words, it doesn't want to give up stuff only to find that the U.S. is not going, and the international community is not going to reciprocate on its promises, because if it doesn't, North Korea is a complete loser at that point. To address these shortcomings, the United States should adopt a reciprocal phased strategy centered on implementing a peace regime. The initial phase should seek to freeze the North Korea's nuclear program in return for limited sanctions relief tied to snapback provisions if North Korea violates one of these demands. In other words, we're not trying to eliminate the North Korean program right now. It's too early to do that, but we need to freeze it, because remember those things I told you about the testing? They haven't occurred yet, but when they do, status quo is going to change. So we need to do these things, but we need to freeze the program before the status quo changes. And so what we need to ask North Korea to do 3 things. First, no provocations. Nothing along the DMZ like we saw in 2015. Nothing along the NLL as we saw under Kim Jong-il. So number 2, no testing. Absolutely no testing. If you're doing no testing, then you can't make progress on your nuclear program. So no missile tests, no nuclear tests, no nothing. Number 3, no proliferation. We don't want to see another thing where North Korean technology pops up in Syria, as they supposedly did back several years ago. Want North Korea to understand you cannot take whatever technology that you've developed over your nuclear program and sell it to the outside world. So if you do those 3 things, then basically we will give you some sanctions relief, some security guarantees. And so after these measures are in place for a reasonable amount of time, the 2 sides could then pursue a reciprocal process in which additional steps toward denuclearization can be coupled with a strategy of corresponding reciprocal concessions and confidence building measures. In other words, you freeze everything, you let things sit for a while, you let the situation stabilize, then you start the give and take in terms of we'll give you something, you give us something. We give you something, you give us something. And we build up confidence building measures. And the idea is to try to tie North Korea into the larger international community economically. Why? Because if you go back and listen to Kim Jong-un's first official speech, the first speech he made publicly, it was on April 15th, 2012. It was the 100th anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth. Very big deal. And in that speech, he talked about economic development. He did not talk about the nuclear development. I think this is where Kim wants to put his legitimacy, is on the economy, not on the nuclear program. But he has no choice. If he can't make progress on the economy, he's got to make progress on the nuclear program, which he has much more control over because he needs outside resources in order to build up the economy. So that's basically the strategy I'm putting forward. In this way, Kim Jong-un can make substantive steps toward denuclearization without losing face or giving up something for nothing. Security guarantees and economic incentives, including an end to the Korean War declaration and sanctions relief, can come from the United States and the international community, which would keep North Korea invested in a process over a long period of time. In addition, as North Korea invests itself further into this peace regime, Kim Jong-un could garner legitimacy for something other than developing his country's nuclear program. He can portray himself and to his people and the wider leadership as a leader who brought peace, security, and economic prosperity to the country, which has never known any of these goals, thus weakening the rationale for retaining a nuclear program. Second, integrate denuclearization into the larger U.S. strategy in Asia focused on managing the relationship with China. By keeping denuclearization of North Korea as an independent goal unto itself, the United States has undermined its ability to manage relations with regional allies while giving adversaries additional ways to counter U.S. influence in the region. And why I say this is very important is that politically inside the United States, making upfront concessions to North Korea in a black and white zero-sum game on the Korean Peninsula is a non-starter. Biden would be basically criticized from the left and the right if he were to do that, because it makes us look weak. And it looks like we're rewarding bad behavior. But if you tie it as part of this great power competition with China, in other words, driving a wedge between Pyongyang and Beijing by engaging with the North Koreans, which we saw worked. I mean, think about it. Xi Jinping cannot stand Kim Jong-un. He would not talk to Kim Jong-un when Kim Jong-un came to power after his father's death at the end of 2011. For basically 7 years, he kept the two countries really did not meet with each other. Until what happened? Until Trump said, I'm willing to meet with Kim Jong-un in Singapore. All of a sudden, Beijing was on the phone to Pyongyang. Hey, come to Beijing. We need to talk. Why? Because they saw the United States getting serious about engaging with North Korea, which then potentially would weaken China's buffer, North Korea, on its border. If all of a sudden you had North Korea seriously engaging the United States and South Korea, that weakens China's overall security and defers and basically directs their attention away from things like Taiwan and South China Sea onto the Korean Peninsula, instead of having this buffer state, North Korea, that is basically guarding its flank. No longer has that if the U.S. is seriously engaging North Korea. So, for example, South Korea's leadership transition to a progressive administration had an adverse effect on bilateral relations with U.S. and Japan. In other words, when we have a zero-sum game on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea, it also can interfere with our engagement with our allies. When you had the Moon administration, a progressive administration that wanted to engage North Korea, come into power in South Korea, the U.S.-South Korean relationship was strained to a certain extent, as was the South Korean-Japanese relationship, because you had in the United States two conservative, basically, administrations, and you had a progressive administration in Seoul, and it made it very difficult to engage within the trilateral alliance. And now that we have a conservatives in all three, basically a traditional administration in the U.S., Biden, and conservative administrations in Tokyo and Seoul, things work well. But if you were to get another progressive administration in Seoul, it would cause problems again, or it would cause tensions within the alliance. So it's things that our current strategy has all these unintended consequences, negative consequences for dealing with North Korea, that should be addressed as part of our overall strategy with North Korea. So basically, what we need to do is, moving forward, I think we need to have a fundamental shift in the way that we deal with North Korea. It's the North Korea that we have, not necessarily the North Korea that we want, but we're going to have to deal with reality, because at some point in the future, I don't know when this will happen, status quo will shift. And then the American president is going to have to explain to the American people why this country that we have criticized since the end of the Korean War, and that we have called them crazy and insane and part of the axis of evil, now all of a sudden have an ability to hold cities hostage, U.S. cities hostage with their nuclear weapons. That puts the U.S. in a very untenable and potentially very dangerous situation about how we're going to deal with North Korea once we get, if the status quo ever does shift in North Korea's favor. And I'll leave it at that, and then we can kind of question